Good morning and welcome to the first week of our course Photography at the MFA. My name is Kristen Hoskins and I'm the Curator of Lectures, Courses, and Concerts. Today's lecture is Collection Beginnings, presented by Anne Havinga, Estrellita, and Yousuf Karsh, Senior Curator of Photographs. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Anne Havinga.
Good morning. Hi, welcome. Okay. I'm recovering from a broken leg, so I'm going to sit. This series of talks this week and in the next couple of weeks is in conjunction with the two photography shows that we have on view, Alfred Stieglitz and Modern America in the Ritts Gallery, and Charles Sheeler, Doylestown to Detroit, which is in the Brown Gallery. These two shows are very much about the history of this collection of photographs, and so we thought it would be interesting to have this, to post this course, which tells you more about how this collection was made, because it's a very interesting story. The MFA possesses one of the oldest photography collections in America, established in 1924 when Alfred Stieglitz gave us 27 of his photographs. This lecture is to tell you about this acquisition and the great influence it has had on the development of our collection. Stieglitz, who was based in New York, had tried for many years to persuade his museum, being the Met, to accept a gift of photographs, but having been turned down again and again, the effort seemed to be in vain. So in 1923, when he befriended Ananda Coomaraswamy, who was the MFA Boston's first curator of Indian art and also an amateur photographer, Stieglitz must have thought that he had found his chance, and he proposed that the MFA receive such a gift. Coomaraswamy approached the trustees before the photographs were even printed to see if they were in principle interested. Stieglitz offered 12 photographs. The trustees agreed, and Stieglitz took an entire year to make museum-quality prints, and in the end, he gave us 27 photographs in 1924. This was the first significant group of works by a single photographer to enter a major American art museum as art. The acquisition was important to us. It was also extremely important to Stieglitz, who had strived for decades to prove that photography was a fine art. A few years later, in 1929, the Metropolitan accepted a similar gift, and Stieglitz wrote to Coomaraswamy, and I quote, and this is an often repeated quote in our field, "My dear Coomaraswamy, the Met Museum has opened its sacred halls to photography. 22 of my photographs have performed the miracle. I suppose Boston helped pave the way." He gave us views of New York, like the two you see on the screen. These are early pictures of the rising modern metropolis of New York, pictures in which he explored viewing the city at different atmospheric conditions, in different weather. He gave portraits of his friends. Here on the left, we have the artist John Marin, who was one of the artists in Stieglitz's stable, whose work he exhibited in his gallery, and the surprising, surrealistic portrayal of Dorothy True on the right, who was a friend of Georgia O'Keeffe, Stieglitz's second wife, a happy accident kind of picture, a double exposure, as you can see. He gave views of nature taken at the Stieglitz family compound in Lake George in upstate New York, including his cloud series, which he called equivalents, such as you see on the left, and his portrayal of trees on the right. And he gave pictures of O'Keeffe, with whom he had started a relationship in about 100 years ago this year, 1916, 1917, and of whom he was in the midst of making a long serial portrait, which he called A Portrait in Time, a portrait that explored the facets of her physiognomy and her personality, portrayed as a modern 20th century woman. After Stieglitz's death, O'Keeffe set to disseminating the estate. He died in the mid-1940s. She first gave 1,000 photographs to the National Gallery in Washington, which she called the Key Set, and then she gave select groups to each of the museums that had shown interest and acquired her husband's work. For the MFA, she provided an additional 42 prints in 1950. They came into the collection in 1950. They were very carefully selected to round out the collection to make an excellent overview of the artist's career. There were views of Lake George, like you see on the left, more portraits of herself, which in fact she didn't outright give us. She put them on long-term loan, 7 portraits of herself, and we used to joke that they have become an acquisition in the mid-90s, but we used to joke that that was so that she could exert control over what we did with the pictures. But like the one on the right. Here's a pair, the picture on the left. These are both views of his window outside his gallery at 291 Fifth Avenue. The picture on the left, Stieglitz gave, and O'Keeffe chose to give us the picture on the right, a study in darks, and now a study in lights. So she thought very carefully about what we were going to get, and her additions made our collection, as the Stieglitz scholar Doris Bree has written, the finest, most highly distilled small collection that can ever be assembled to show the full extent of his work in concentrated form. This acquisition led to gifts by Stieglitz's friends, the British photographer Frederick Evans, whose work you see on the left, and the American photographer Clarence White. Both of these photographers made soft focus photographs in the popular turn-of-the-century artistic style known as pictorialism, which was Stieglitz's early style, and more hard-edged modernist style works by Stieglitz's contemporary, Paul Outerbridge, which came into the collection as a gift in the 1930s. In the 1940s, the museum received a large gift of 100 daguerreotypes by Southworth and Hawes, the celebrated Boston photographer team of the 1840s to 60s. These are daguerreotypes. A daguerreotype is a unique photographic image on a silvered plate. It was one of the first photographic processes invented by Daguerre in France and announced to the world in 1839, the first announcement of photography to the world. And Southworth and Hawes were among the initial practitioners of the daguerreotype process here in our country, and they made many portraits of leading figures of the day, including the statesman Daniel Webster, whose work you see on the left. This gift came from the descendants of Hawes, the Hawes family, and it also included many wonderful family portraits, such as this view on the right of Nancy Southworth Hawes. Hawes was married to Southworth's sister, so that's why her name is Nancy Southworth Hawes. And she holds their daughter, Marin, and as an infant. It's a picture that has great naturalness and spontaneity, which is what Southworth and Hawes is known for. It wasn't until the 1960s that we made our first photographic purchases, when Cliff Ackley joined the staff. And you see a picture of Cliff on the right. In hiring Cliff, the museum knew that it was getting a scholar of Dutch prints, but it also turned out that Cliff had great interest and knowledge in several other areas as well, including photography. His first purchases was a group of 5 Edward Weston photographs, including this one of Diego Rivera, taken in 1923. Cliff searched and attracted some gifts of funds and some supporters, including, in the early years, the Polaroid Corporation. And Polaroid gave annual gifts of money for him to buy photographs. He started out by buying photographs by important American photographers, such as Louis Hine on the left and Walker Evans on the right. He bought a small number of photojournalistic work, such as this Eugene Smith that you see on the left. This is a startling portrayal that Eugene Smith made of a mother bathing her severely deformed daughter who had suffered from Minamata disease in Japan, which is a type of mercury poisoning. The photograph was made in 1971, and Cliff purchased it in 1973. So it was a contemporary work of art at that time. And on the right, you see a very artistic picture that Cliff bought in the early 70s by Imogen Cunningham, who was one of Edward Weston's friends, called Exploding Bud. But before long, Cliff was buying pictures that directly related to the Stieglitz collection, as if he were embroidering on a theme. For example, in response to Stieglitz's portraits of O'Keeffe, Cliff bought portraits that Stieglitz's friend Paul Strand made of his wife, Rebecca, pictures that were clearly inspired and made in response to Stieglitz's series. And then he went further. He bought the picture on the left that Harry Callahan, the great photographer who was first based in Chicago and then at RISD in Providence, Rhode Island. Harry Callahan made many photographs of his wife, Eleanor, and that's what you see on the left. This is a very, very early acquisition by Cliff. And then Cliff went on to buy photographs that other photographers made of their wives and muses, such as the two Nick Nixon pictures on the right. Nick is a local Boston photographer, and these are pictures he made of Bibi and their first child. Cliff bought, in response to the great portraits of O'Keeffe, he also brought some what you might call large head pictures, pictures in which the head fills the frame, such as these here. Man Ray's surrealistic solarized nude at the left. In the lower middle, Auguste Saunders' portrait of the painter Heinrich Herle. And at the upper right, the 19th century British photographer Julia Margaret Cameron's picture of Adriana. He also bought photographs of hands in response to Stieglitz's photographs of hands. So we see Stieglitz's picture of O'Keeffe's hands in the middle, picture often called Hands in a Thimble. She's holding a thimble, and there's a little needle that she's in the midst of sewing. He turned the photograph. Obviously, she had her hands in her lap, and he turned the photograph to make a more abstract design. Stieglitz felt that a portrait does not have to be of one's face in order to say something about the personality and circumstances of a sitter's life. So on the left, we have Paul Strand's photograph of his wife, Rebecca's hands, a picture in which it looks like she's maybe saying stop, a picture that could be seen as a portrait of the lifeline in a hand, a picture that could be read a lot of different ways. Or Tina Modati's photograph of workers' hands, roughened workers' hands on the right. And here are more hands. We've had fun with hands. Some of these photographs tell you a lot, as Stieglitz would have said, about the person's personality. So we have Berenice Abbott at the top, a photograph of the hands of Jean Cocteau, and you can tell that this is a person who's aware that he has beautiful hands, I think, as he puts them over his hat. On the right, Albert Renger-Patsch's photograph of praying hands, hands that have a lot, that it looks to, well, that person looks to me like a very practical person, maybe. And Nick Nixon's photograph of a resident at an elderly home here in Boston, which he's titled A.B. Boston, a picture of someone who's almost melting into ethereality before your eyes. So for Cliff, building a collection was like, as I said, embroidering on a theme, growing the collection in bunches, finding relationships, trying to make the collection a very usable collection because you already could see groups of pictures emerging from it that you could show in exhibitions or display in a study room setting to visitors. And we still very much acquire this way. He was always looking for connections and relationships with other works in the collection. So here are a group of nudes, building upon Stieglitz's nude view of O'Keeffe at the left. We have at the right, the Czech photographer Dridikal's portrait of a nude, a sort of surrealistic interpretation of a nude, and the sort of evanescent, I think, the George Platt Lynes view of a nude, which is actually of his sister, Elizabeth Hines, at the bottom. Trees, building upon Stieglitz's trees, the dancing trees picture at the top. We have at the left, Renger Pacha's photograph of trees, and at the right, Paul Strand's close-up of a tree stump and vine. And close-ups from nature. Building upon Stieglitz's Apple and Drops of Rain, Cliff bought Anna Atkins's close-up of a thistle. This blue photograph is a cyanotype, and Anna Atkins is one of the earliest photographers. You'll see the picture was made in the early 1850s. She was a botanist. She heard about the photographic process through her father, who was a scientist and connected with some of the earliest founders of photography. She actually is the person who published the first photographically illustrated book, which was of algae in 1843. These are cyanotypes, which is basically the blueprint process that architects have used for so many years, an image where the photographic paper is sensitized, and she puts the plant on the paper in sun, and it develops from there, so it's unique. And from that, Cliff went on to buy other kinds of close-ups, often of nature, like the Florence Henry, pineapple and cactus on the left, or not always of nature, such as the picture on the right, which seems to be of the shadow of a chair seat, for those of you who haven't already figured that out. When O'Keeffe made her gift, her second gift of Stieglitz's to the collection, she gave us a small black and white silver print of Stieglitz's famous steerage, which you see on the left. And she also gave us a large photogravure version of the same image that you see on the right. It is a view that many people of an ocean liner that many people have interpreted as a photograph of immigration, but which was in fact taken by Stieglitz when he was traveling from New York to Europe. And it is seen as one of the earliest icons of the modernist emphasis on geometry that is present in the history of photography. It's a picture that was made in 1907, that Stieglitz, when he took it, he printed it once, he put it away, and a few years later he went back and looked at it and said, oh, this is all about geometric forms and shapes. This is one of the first, if not the first, modernist photograph, and he started promoting it. And so he printed it, and he also then printed it in photogravure, which is an inked-based photographic process that was developed by the earliest photographers in the mid-1850s as a means to get print images of their work, because so many of the early photographs faded over time, and they were trying to find ways to counteract that, so they developed the photogravure process. The turn of the century photographers, like Stieglitz and others, loved this process for the richness of the inky tone, that dense inky quality. It also aligned their work with more traditional printmaking techniques, and these were artists who were trying to promote photography as an art form, so they liked that alliance. So O'Keeffe gave us both of these, and so Cliff started to develop this idea more as well, and he started buying photographs that relate to our print collection, such as on the left is an Arthur Wesley Dow, Boston artist, Ipswich-based at the turn of the century, a color woodcut on the left, and Cliff bought this cyanotype print, again, same blue process, of a related view on the right. And he bought, in the mid-1970s, this wonderful pair of the same negative printed two different ways by Paul Strand, who was another one of Stieglitz's close friends. This is another close-up of nature. taken in Nova Scotia. The print on the left is a platinum print, which was the preferred process by which photographers made their work at the turn of the 10th century until around World War I. They used platinum or sometimes palladium, which created a warm tonality, as you can see, so it's with very subtle. And then he also acquired the gelatin silver, which is your basic black and white process that we all know from our youth. Black and white prints are usually gelatin silver, print of the same negative on the right. And the reason he was interested in this is because of our great print collection. We have one of the most important print collections in the country here, and we are a place that is interested in the different ways that printmakers have printed their work and the different qualities of expressiveness in different prints. So he sought out this pair. The platinum, you may all know platinum's a more precious metal than silver, so the platinum print was a more expensive thing to make and is highly revered by many people as a result, and it's a very beautiful print. But the silver print is also very beautiful, and we often say to ourselves in the department that the silver print in some ways evokes the texture of the granite very beautifully. So that's interesting to us too. I think you can see from the slides that Cliff focused quite a bit on modernism in photography, and that's indeed true. Again, he was building off of the Stieglitzes. Here are two more, Edward Steichen's Pears and an Apple on the left, another close-up from nature. And Margaret Bourke-White's George Washington Bridge, a New York picture. So he started buying pictures of New York, architecture pictures. There was a fund that he could access here that was designated for architectural themes, and he used that quite frequently for photographs. It was not a department fund, it was a general acquisition fund. He also bought some Depression-era photographs, documents of America, such as this Walker Evans on the left, man and movie poster, and Dorothea Lange's great migrant family on the right. And he bought European modernist works, same time period, made in Europe, building out further from the collection, works such as on the right, Moholy-Nagy's photograph that shows the influence of Cubism, Constructivism, Surrealism, and Dadaism on photography, capitalizing on creating unconventional views through rigorous objectivity and surprising camera angles. And what you see on the left is a photographically illustrated book by Man Ray called Facile, which has features Paul Éluard's poetry and photographs of Paul Éluard's wife, Noosh, a book in which the text is beautifully integrated with the photographic images, a book that is about symbolism and romanticism, that explores elegant design, eroticism, and a striking interplay of lights and darks, which were all key concepts of modernism, especially in Europe. Cliff bought some 19th century photographs. I mentioned before he had a fund for architectural subjects, so the photograph on the left was acquired through that means. These are views, whereas Stieglitz photographed New York, these are views made of Paris. So we have a group of photographs of Paris, the city of Paris, in the collection. These were both made by the same photographer. The one on the right was taken in the Bois de Boulogne, the great park on the west side of Paris, after it was renovated by the government. Very beautiful, poetic pictures. And Cliff was always thrilled when gifts came into the collection that built new and surprising connections. So what you see on the left is a photograph by Gustav Legree, the mid-19th century great French photographer known for being a leader in development of photographic processes in the mid-19th century, a teacher of many of the up-and-coming photographers who were starting out in the 1850s, wrote a manual about photography, who made masterful works such as this cloudy sky view, a picture that is, for the 19th century, large in size. I'm saying it's about 12 by 15 inches, which in the 19th century was very large in size. It's a picture that would have been made with a glass negative that was the same size. It is a picture in which he used a separate negative for the sky as for the sea, because the clouds would have taken a different rate of exposure. And so in order to get them to come out, he had to photograph them separately. This is a picture that Legree would have, his intentions were to channel what was going on in 19th century French painting. It's a highly romanticized picture, obviously, very dramatic. And that's why he wanted it to be large so that it could hold its own in the realm of art, the larger realm of art. The picture on the right is by the Japanese photographer, Hiroshi Sugimoto, contemporary photographer, who, since around 1990, started photographing seascapes around the world. He marked his lens right in the middle, so that in each seascape that he made, the middle line of the image is where the horizon is. It's a picture that, in a way, is also very ambitious. He was thinking, and it's about the same size as Legree picture. He was thinking in his head, he was imagining what it would be like for ancient man to see the sea for the first time. And he's trying to capture that aha moment. So it has a certain sense of infinity and relates to concerns of contemporary art today. Cliff also had some pet areas, like all curators do, that he cultivated. He noticed that the medium of photography had been used very aptly to document aspects of American popular culture. Think Diane Arbus, for example, his works you see on the wall. Think Robert Frank, the Swiss photographer who came to the US and photographed American popular culture. And so Cliff started to develop our holdings of this area. And we did a show in the early 1890s, and I helped Cliff with that show in one of my early years here. And one of the fascinating aspects of this section of the collection is that these photographs always reveal that a photograph is about the photographer's point of view. And you have, I think, a sense of Arbus's point of view in the making of these pictures, what she thought when she was making this picture, what she thought of her subject, like the lady on the left. Some of these pictures are ironic, some celebratory, like Ouija's picture of a woman in a jazz club from the early mid-20th century, taken in New York. John Gutmann, the German photographer who immigrated to the US with the war and made this photograph of car hops in Hollywood, California. And some of them are both celebratory and ironic at the same time, like I think all three of these. Burke Uzzell's photograph of Daytona Beach on the left with the McDonald's sign behind. The bottom, Lee Friedlander's photograph of Christmas tree decorations arriving, overly ornate. And the New Orleans photographer Clarence John Laughlin's photograph of a Coca-Cola sign that has had seen better days, but is beautiful and ironic and celebratory all at the same time. And here are a couple of color photographs that are also about America that Cliff acquired. Joel Sternfeld's photograph on the left of after a flash flood, Rancho Barrage, and you can see that the car has tumbled down the hill, down into the hole. A picture that's more ironic than celebratory, of course. And Joel Meyerowitz's photograph on the right, which is really less about America and I think more about the photographic process, because for me this picture is about what photography does. It's about color and black and white. Cliff acquired a small number of color photographs for the collection. He didn't go into great depth in this area of collecting because color photographs, at least from this period, from the 70s, 80s, and most of the 90s, the color process, as you all may know from pictures of your youth, is sensitive and the colors can change and fade. And the best thing to do for color photographs is to put them in cold storage. And we didn't have a cold storage room until the mid-1990s. So it wasn't until the mid-1990s that we started to focus more on building the color as a part of our collection. Cliff bought some more local photographers. I showed Nick Nixon a bit ago. Here we have two women local photographers, Marika Sindis on the left, who made important color work starting in the 1960s, who recently passed away. Some of you may have known her. Elsa Dorfman, the great Cambridge portrait photographer, best known for her large color Polaroids. This is a picture that she took early on of herself, me in my new coat, from the late 1960s. When I came here, I was in the department since 1989, and in 2001, I was lucky to be promoted to be curator of photographs. We had not had a dedicated photography curator until that time. I had worked closely with Cliff. I had expertise in prints and drawings and an interest in photography, but it became more and more important as photography became more important for our shows and for our visitors, had more and more created much more visibility for the museum if we had a more dedicated program. And so I was appointed photography curator in 2001. Cliff was still chair of the department at that time. And I worked alongside Cliff and also another colleague, some of you may know, Karen Haas, who is curator of the Lane collection of photographs, about which you'll hear soon. And now Kristen Gresh, another curator, and James Layton, another member of our staff, so that we have a pretty full-fledged team of people all thinking and working together. So since that time, we have continued to develop some of the themes that Cliff had initiated. And on the left is Joseph Sudek's view from his window. We acquired an entire collection of some 60 photographs by Joseph Sudek, a great Czech modernist photographer who had a close friend who had moved to New York, a young woman by the name of Sonia Belatti, who had survived the Holocaust and lost her family, and she was Czech too, and she had apprenticed to Sudek just after the war, and then she came to the States, and she and her husband and Sudek maintained a long correspondence, and they sent photographs back and forth. And after she passed away, her husband steered her Sudek collection to us. And one of the great marvels of that, it was pretty marvelous. It was amazing that none of the New York museums got that collection, but he said whenever they came to Boston, the guards were so nice. And so we got that collection. So that's one of those. And we did a show in 2003 or 4 of the Sudek collection. We acquired the Edward Steichen in the middle on the top, and we acquired the Brancusi on the right. I think of all three of these as being a little more European European modernist in style, even though Steichen was American, because he made that photograph while he was living in France. And and in the one in the Steichen, which is called Triumph of an Egg, it's an egg inside the cone of a phonograph, balanced on a thing, balanced on a pillar column, and the bell is a phonograph bell. And the Brancusi is one of his sculptures, a photograph of one of his sculptures, Bird in Space, a sculpture that you may have seen, a long, gleaming column that Brancusi started making photographs to show his work to prospective clients. And then he realized that through photography, he could make an artwork of his photograph. And so it wasn't always about describing the sculpture. It was often about making a new thing, a new conception. And he made a number of photographs called his photo radieuse, or his radiant photographs, in which he captured the sculpture with the light gleaming right off it. And that's a wonderful, very abstract, modernist interpretation of one of his works. We acquired more hands pictures. On the left, a photograph by John Copeland, the British photographer who, during his career, was an art historian, a museum director. He founded an art journal. And in his retirement, he started photographing his own body, his own aging body, and interpreting it often through the close-up. And these are large pictures, actually, and that's a photograph of hands. It almost looks like a photograph of a woman's legs, perhaps. And a photograph that Nick Nixon, who has done some work in color in the last years, of his wife Bibi's hands. We've done trees, more trees. This is by Robert Adams, a now older photographer who lives in the Northwest. This is actually a series of photogravures, so we're still exploring the printmaking process and the connections between printmaking and photography in the photography collection. It's a wonderful group of large photogravures of trees. And I've had my own pet interests, and one of them being 19th century photography, because it occurred to me that the 19th century material often exists in very few prints, so the material is extremely rare, and it's being gobbled up by other museums, and so it seemed to me that we better start getting more of this material while we still had the opportunity to do so. And so we did quite a lot. For about a decade, we bought quite a bit of 19th century photography, and we did a show called Silver, Salt, and Sunlight in the Ritts Gallery a few years back, celebrating all these acquisitions. And what you see here on the left is Edward Steichen's photograph called Solitude of F. Holland Day, who is one of the most important Boston photographers from the turn of the century, who was active primarily in the 1890s and just after the turn of the century, and during those years was widely considered to be the rival of Stieglitz, but who drifted away from photography later because Stieglitz was so competitive and Day was not so interested in being so competitive. And the photograph on the right, which is by Lewis Carroll, the great author of Alice in Wonderland, who also photographed young girls mostly, including Alice. This is a picture of Z. Kitchen, who was, you may know that Carroll was a mathematics professor at Oxford. I think I'm right, it's Oxford. And this was the daughter of one of his professor colleagues. A very poetic picture in a stunningly beautiful print that we're very proud to have acquired. Here are two more 19th century photographs that we have gotten in the last decade or so. The picture on the left by Auguste Rosalie Besson was one of the first, well, it was really the first photograph made on Mont Blanc, the highest Alp in the Alps. He had wanted to make some photographs of an ascent of Mont Blanc for some years, and he wasn't successful until July 1861. He had to, this is a picture that is large for the time, so it is about 15 inches by 10 inches. He had to lug up the mountain glass plate negatives that were the same size, 15 inches by 10 inches, and glass bottles of chemicals. And then he had to brave the cold temperatures, avalanches, altitude sickness in order to make his photograph. He came down with 3 pictures that were actually successful, and this is my favorite, a picture that's really about the patterns of lights and darks too, as well as about the ascent. You see his fellow climbers there. And the picture on the right, which is by Chevalier Louis-Pierre Théophile Dubois de Nouveau, who was a Frenchman who ended up in Brussels and who made a series of photographs of the Silver Jubilee of the King of Belgium, King Leopold I. He set up cameras with assistants all along the parade route. There were 3 days of festivities, and he photographed the parade. And this is interesting because it's an early example of photojournalism, and it's interesting for us because we have magnificent Albrecht Dürer prints of the festival parade of the Emperor Maximilian. So we have another connection with the collection through in this way as well. So that's another amazing work that we were able to acquire in recent years, very rare and little known. And we have continued to go along this vein. Here are 2, again, local photographers. Abe Morell, whom I haven't shown yet this morning, A View of New York, like Stieglitz's Views of New York. A picture that was made through the camera Obscura process, a picture that in which he darkened the room. So he went to a friend's bedroom in New York across from the Empire State Building. He darkened the window by putting black plastic all over the window, and then he cut a little hole in the black plastic, and that projected the outside world in. And when you do that, it's called the camera obscura process. It reflects upside down across whatever is in the room. And then he puts his camera in the room and he takes a picture of what is portrayed across the furnishings of the room. So you see the Empire State Building upside down across the bed. And another Nick Nixon of his wife, Bibi, and her sisters, one of the extended series of photographs that Nick has made of his wife and her 3 sisters called the Brown Sisters since the mid-1970s. And we were able to acquire the whole group, and we're continuing to acquire these pictures annually as they are made by Nick. That is what I prepared, and I thought I would be going past 12. So I'm done earlier than I intended, but I'm more than happy to talk more specifically, to show slides again, and to talk to have a conversation with people about other aspects of the collection. Maybe we want to turn on the lights. They probably thought I was going to go on longer. I thought for sure I was going to go on too long. Having shown 40 slides. Yes?
Are you able to buy them mostly, through private means, collections, or through auctions, or
So most of the acquisitions are made through dealers, occasionally through auctions. We did not have dedicated photography purchase funds until around 2007, I think it was, when we got 2005, we got our first acquisition fund. And then we got another acquisition fund a few years, right after 2010 or something like that. They're small acquisition funds. So there are general acquisition funds in the museum that are for a variety of different, can be used for a variety of different purposes, so we sometimes lobby for those. We have generous collectors and donors who give us money from time to time, so we acquire things that way, and people have given us photographs and collections of photographs. So we're always looking for opportunities to build the collection out in this way, the idea of having correspondences and connections, which gives us much more of a versatile collection. We're always looking for opportunities. The traditional way that we've seen things that are on the market, starting in the 60s, there were only a couple of photo galleries. There was one here in Boston, the Carl Siebenbaum Gallery. There was one in New York, the Whitkin Gallery. But there were a few private photography dealers who used to come through with a portfolio of pictures. And when Cliff Ackley started acquiring, much of what he purchased was either from the Boston gallery, the gallery in New York, or from these dealers who peddled works. And there are dealers who still come through peddling works. They're still private dealers. There's a wonderful private dealer in the Boston area called Mac Lee Gallery in Winchester. You can make an appointment to go to his office and see things there. There are wonderful galleries here in Boston. There's Robert Klein on Newbury Street. There are a group of photography-based galleries in the South End and others, a smattering around the city and the area. And so we still find acquisitions that way. We always look for ways to find connections with what we have. And in fact, Cliff's attitude about finding connections has something that has made its way into the museum's entire art acquisition program. Whenever we acquire something, we have to write a page-long defense about why this is important, and there are 3 bullet points. The first bullet point is, why is this work important? The second bullet point is, how does it make sense for us to acquire it? How does it fit into our collection? So what are those correspondences and relationships? How are you going to use it? And the third bullet point is price or some information about the donor. So that's still how we do. The value for photographs has grown tremendously over the last several decades. When Cliff started out, photographs were, maybe $100 or a couple $100. When I started in 1989, he was still paying a maximum of a couple $1,000 maximum for a photograph. In my first year here, we acquired a 19th century French photograph by Eugene Kubilay, and the price was $5,000. And Cliff and I were quaking about whether we could propose that because it seemed so high. And now we have acquired photographs that are upwards of 100, and we've occasionally even more than $200,000 we've acquired photographs in that range. And so the market has developed tremendously in the last couple of decades, astonishingly. I think you're probably all aware how photography is one of the primary draws for museums, for audiences. In my early years here, I learned from the information desk, the people who sit at the information desk, would tell me people would first ask for the Impressionist paintings, and secondly, they'd ask where the photography was. So that gave us hope that we could develop more activity with photography. In around 2008, 7, 8, we acquired our first dedicated photography gallery, which is the Ritts Gallery, where the Stieglitz show is on view right now. And Herb Ritts was a celebrated fashion photographer and celebrity photographer, did a lot of work for leading magazines, and our museum did a major show of his work around 2001 or 2 or something like that, or 3. And then he passed away, and he had made a lot of money, and they gave us enough money to endow a gallery. Our photography gallery is considered small by major museum standards. We would have liked a bigger space, but we have something to strive for, I guess. We're glad to have that. It's in a wonderful location in the building, as I'm sure you've all noticed, because people walk through that space, and we kind of capture people in that space, which is great. Yeah.
The description that you gave of the criteria for acquiring something is that it somehow relates back to something in the museum, but the field itself is vast.
Yeah.
And so...
and it's getting more vast with digital photography, too.
Exactly. And so it's almost like you're confining yourselves, understandably, because you have to have some coherence. But have you thought about where you go from here in terms of things that perhaps aren't so connected?
Well, we occasionally branch out and get something that's less connected, but we're building from what we need to find. You know, we always wonder, well, when are we going to show this? How are we going to use this? And so we have to try to find, we can be pretty inspired in finding connections. So if we need to be, if we see something's really important, we can find ways to tie it in. But we see it as growing like a web, like a spider web. Some people say, in some curators choose to find things that fill gaps, and we do to a certain extent want to fill gaps. But we're more inclined to find resonances. And that works incredibly well for us because our collection is linked. And sometimes dealers will say to us, "What are you looking for?" And we'll say, "Well, we kind of have some ideas about what we're looking for, but to be honest, when we see something that makes sense for us, we know it because we can find 5 different contexts in which we're going to use it." So it happens like that. So the longer a curator is here and the better the curator knows the collection, the more ways the curator will find connections with the collection. And sometimes we find connections with other departments' collections. The photography section of the museum has recently separated from prints and drawings, so photography is its own department. It was, until this past year, part of prints and drawings. It was prints and drawings and photographs. We are still in the same offices. We share a study room, which is a viewing room where people can make appointments. You can make appointments to view things from the collection. And we like the fact that we are both together and apart. We like the fact that we can build on the connections between our 2 collections. And we like the fact that photography, by being an independent department, has more leverage both within the museum administration and within our field. We can it's easier for us to develop our own support committees and so forth by being an independent department. Yes, many questions, great. Start with the front and then back and then back. Yes?
You've purchased photography for a long time. For instance, you have the Lewis Carroll.
Yeah.
Which is lovely in terms of its graceful lines, etc., and the time period. But looking at it through the lens of our modern perceptions, what do you do with a picture like that? Can you actually show that? Because
yes, we've shown it. Are you worried? Well, all works on paper are light sensitive. So one worries about exhibiting for long periods of time any work on paper because paper is light sensitive.
no, my point is that it's pornographic almost.
Oh.
And it's
Lewis Carroll may have taken an interest.
I mean, the young woman
Of
is
Victoria.
like a less.
Yeah, it is.
She's a little girl, and it's.
Yes, she is. And you could read that into that picture. She also looks like a sweet little girl. You could just read it as a sweet little girl.
Not anymore.
Lewis Carroll, the great Lewis Carroll, people have wondered about his motives in taking some of his photographs of young girls.
That's really
Right.
It's not known whether he had relationships with any of them. Yes, sir, at the middle in the back, yes. Oh, I promised this man, well, we'll do one in the back and then we'll come back down to you. Yes, sir.
I'm happy to cede the microphone to anybody who'd like it.
Oh, so people in here, good.
How do you consider, what differentiates your collection from other major museum collections, and where do you see it going in the future to build on whatever strengths you identify?
So our collection is distinguished first because of the great Stieglitz collection, because it was started so early in the country. It is a collection that is that numbers now about 15,000 photographs. And if you come to the subsequent lectures that are part of this series, you'll hear next week about the Lane collection, which my colleague Karen Haas will speak about, which is approximately half the photographs in our collection. It's a collection that was a private collection that was given to us. And then in the subsequent program, you'll hear from Kristen Gresh, who's going to talk about some of the new directions in contemporary photography that we're thinking about now. It is a collection that is often spoken of as having great quality, and that's really because of Cliff Ackley's eye and the way he nurtured the collection in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So for 40 years, he was the sole selector of photographs for the collection, and he chose incredibly well. And when I started here and started going to photography fairs, which is now one of the ways we buy photographs, dealers would often say to me, I sold Cliff such and such picture way back in the 70s. And I realized several years later after I sold it to him that it was the best picture in the group. And Cliff always, I would hear this again and again. So it's a collection that's known, that is distinguished for its quality. We plan to continue to build the collection in all the related ways that I have mentioned now. We will find new areas, and I only mentioned for me the area of 19th century because that's an area that I've done a lot with, but we're hoping to build in a number of other areas. We've done a lot with mid-century European photography, which we didn't have much of. One of the areas, and Kristen Gresh will probably go into this a little bit in her presentation, but one of the areas that I think we need to develop extensively is Japanese photography. This is a museum that is renowned for its Japanese collection in general, the art collection, the Japanese department, and we have very little Japanese photography, but we ought to have strong holdings in that area, so that's an area that I'm interested in. We are starting to build more American, more color photographs, because we weren't doing that quite as actively as we ought to have been in previous decades because we didn't have cold storage, and so when we're going back and trying to remedy that. Cliff was did less with photojournalism and street photography, pictures that are about the human condition. He did less, much significantly less in that area, so that's another area of the collection that needs real nurturing. And then there's the issue of contemporary, which is always something that we are trying to manage as much as we can and do as much as possible with. There's digital photography, there's what are we going to do with Instagram and images that are, and which we want to do something with. So that's another nut to crack for us. So, yes.
Thank you. Actually, I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one has to do with price. When something becomes offered through a dealer, and you feel it'll fit into one of the collections, is there any such thing as negotiation, or if there's something that you want, you just try to acquire the funds from the sources to get it?
We don't propose a price for anything because we don't think that it's right. Some people may think that we might propose a price because we certainly have a sense of the market, but it's inappropriate us to be a both buyer and a setter price. So we don't propose a price. We sometimes negotiate with a dealer if we think the price is astonishingly high. We do a fair amount of research on the price. We'll track auction records, for example, of that artist's work. And if we discover that the dealer who's selling it to us bought so much for it and is now charging so much, we will say, hey, that seems like a kind of outrageous markup. So we will negotiate in that way. But we also want to maintain good relations with the dealer. We're not trying to take advantage of the dealers either, because the dealers are our sources for great things. So we want to have, we want to have a good relationship with them. One of the things that we investigate quite extensively is whether, if it's a work that's made outside of the country, whether it's been imported properly, whether somebody just brought it through in their suitcase and didn't say anything, or whether they declared it, because we want it always declared. So that's something that we look at quite carefully, and that's good. So different things. The prices vary tremendously, and there are hot areas of the market and less hot areas of the market. Right now, I have noticed that early photography is not as highly valued, so it's a good time to buy early photography. Whereas contemporary work is very highly valued, so some flashy contemporary photographers, the prices can be astronomical. It all depends. You kind of get a sense of the market the more you're in it. So we go to the two main photography fairs that occur now, which is one is in New York in the spring called APAD, and then in the fall in November is one in Paris called Paris Photo. And these are fairs in which anywhere from 100 to 150 dealers will bring their wares from early photography to contemporary work, and you get to see a lot, and you get to learn the market, and you get to meet a lot of people. And so we go to those fairs. That's one of the best ways for us to stay on top of what's coming out, and through connections and so forth.
Thank you. The other thing I wanted to ask you is that switching to digital capture, to date, do you find that images that are captured digitally, is there a variety of printmaking processes that these quote unquote negatives are then presented with that you might want to acquire for that niche that you're trying to develop?
Most of the digital work today is printed by artist photographers, is printed, often it's color, and so the photographer will send their file to a color printing establishment. One of the best known is here in the Boston area. It's called Color Services. There are a couple in New York, and they print the work for the artist. It's rare for a photographer to invest in the equipment to make their own prints nowadays. Yes.
Yes, I'm wondering about in the acquisitions, the value of the printed medium versus the original negative, and how does when you acquire a print, is that an exclusive copy of that piece
Yes,
of work?
basically. It all depends on the photographer and what that photographer sets up as their process. When it's a photograph that involves a negative, which most photographs do, a photographer will print however many they will print. For early photographers, there was no limit, but they didn't make very many prints because it was expensive to make prints. There wasn't a huge market for them. In the mid-20th century, it became common, in the mid-late 20th century, it became common for artist photographers to make editions of prints. So they would make 5, 10, 25, 50, 100. And then they would cap it at that. And those were the number of prints. And collectors would buy, and it would have an edition number on it. Occasionally, photographers don't do editions. They print on demand, and then it's limitless, the number of prints. But there's often more value when there's a limited number. We so that then you have an artist print, an artist's made or authorized print. If you had a printer print it, it would be an authorized print. We actually have a couple of negatives in the collection. We are interested in negatives when they are artistic enough that we would want to exhibit them as art, when they're evocative. And so in that case, we are interested. We would never print from them. That's not. We believe in the artist making the print, or supervising the printing of the print. Another issue that has a lot to do with value in photography is when the artist made the print. And there's often this term that's bandied about called vintage. And a vintage print is basically a print that was made roughly the time of the negative. So say the negative was made in 1940, and the print would have been made in maybe 40 or in the early 40s. A print that's made 10, 20, 40 years later, the artist comes to that negative with a different frame of mind and a different idea of what he's going to do. So the original concept gets a little watered down often. So that's one of the reasons why vintage prints tend to have higher value. But that said, sometimes an artist rethinks a work to such an interesting degree that again, it depends on the artist, but then it could be interesting and it could have high value too. So it really depends. It's an artist by artist situation. Yeah.
Anne?
Yeah.
You focused on the museum's collection acquisition process. Can you talk about how that relates to your decisions about bringing in outside exhibitions? You know, the museum does both, and you're around photography. You guys do both of that.
Probably most of our exhibitions are initiated by the collection because we have a wonderful collection to work with. When we bring in outside shows, it depends on the show. Sometimes we choose an outside show because we think we're the right place to have this show because we have related things and people know some aspect of our collection, so they will be interested in this other aspect of period in time or whatever. Sometimes we bring in outside shows because they are completely different from what we have, and we want to make sure that's part of our program too. And we may not be able to own those pictures, but we want to show that. I think of our exhibition program as being one in which we want to reach a diversity of audiences. So that means we're going to show a diversity of kinds of photography. And one of the great things about photography is that it's important in different ways to different people. It's probably broader than maybe any other department here in a way. It connects different people in different ways. For example, under our old director, who was very interested in fashion photography, I did a lot of fashion photography shows, and that brought in different audiences and was interesting in different ways for different people. So that's a way we do it sometimes. I think we sometimes have to have shows that relate to local photographers. So we have to sometimes have shows that are about the photographic process, about the history of photography, about an individual photographer. So we try to do a mixture of things. And that's how and we see what opportunities are coming up and what we think is what the museum's mission is at the moment, and we try to propose shows that we think make sense for that moment in time. For example, the Stieglitz and Sheeler shows came about at this moment because we knew we were going to have an independent photography department now, and so we wanted to celebrate that moment by having exhibitions that were about the origins of the collection. And the Stieglitz show is about the origin of the MFA collection, and the Sheeler show, which you'll hear about next week, is about the origins of the Lane collection of photographs. So that's a lot of our thinking. Yeah. Yes? I'm glad you have so many questions. It's nice to have a conversation. More interesting than droning on.
I can't help but look at the F. Hollanday there and think
Yeah.
back to Dutch and Sugimoto, and thinking about you had those wonderful dragonfly photographs of his.
Yes.
And thinking about, I think it was Legree, I wasn't familiar with him.
I
the
can go
French.
back to that pair.
Do you, maybe you've done this and I just haven't seen them. Do you ever pair
There.
your permanent painted collection, I mean, that's so French, mid-century, 1800s. Do you ever pair your photographs with some of your paintings of different periods?
Yeah, occasionally we have. Some years ago now, 15 years ago, actually, it's been a while, we did a show called Impressions of France, which was about 19th century French art in different media. And we had paintings, prints, drawings, and photographs all mixed together in the galleries. So we have done that, and we are interested in doing that. One of the areas of the collection that I'm interested photographically is the Barbizon School, because the Barbizon School is an important school in photography as well as it is in paintings, and this museum has great Barbizon holdings in paintings, so it's an area of the collection that we're working on a bit. And maybe we'll do a show in the next few years or some conversation about doing that. We have actually shown these two pictures together. We did a small show one summer years ago on pictures of water. It was just in the so-called hemicycle, that curved space that's near the new information center. There are pictures of the history of the museum in that space right now, but we did pictures that were about water. Seemed like a nice summer theme one year, and we put these two together. So we do occasionally do those kind of 19th century compared with 20th century as well. Yes?
Is the collection online?
Yes. Oh, that's another great thing for you all to know. We were able to fundraise some years ago, and a wonderful, generous donor gave us funds so that we could so-called digitize the collection, so that we could photograph the photography collection and put images of it online. So if you go to the MFA's website, there's a section called Collection where you can look up what we have in the collection, and you can, for the most part, for 95% of the times, you will find an image. That's not true with all the collections in the building because it's not easy to fundraise for that quiet need. Our prints and drawings collection is very underserved in that area. Most of that collection's not. There's information online, but not pictures. It's nice to have the pictures. More questions?
Thank you. This was really very interesting. The majority of the photographs that we saw today were in black and white,
Yeah.
or shades of black and white, and I just want to know if there is still some negativity about
No.
Photographs in color, and the great photographers stayed with black and white even when color was available.
No, the reason I didn't do so much with color is that my purpose in this talk was to talk about the collection beginnings. And so I did less with the last 40, 50 years of photography because my colleagues are going to go more into color. And so it didn't make sense for me to steal that thunder. So I focused on the collection and how it related to the Stieglitz collection, the sort of core principles of building this collection. But you will hear more about that. Yes?
I'm sure you keep track of contemporary trends in photography and how much that affects your acquisitions.
The contemporary trends in terms of what's popular and not popular? Yes. So one of the reasons I was buying 19th century material is because I saw that the market wasn't going, you wouldn't be able to get another Lewis Carroll. Like, we'll change the slide, but that may be one of the last great Lewis Carrolls that you can actually acquire. You know, if there are others, there's only maybe a couple of others that are really great prints that will come on the market because the others are in museum collections already. So, the market for 19th century material has been. It's been a good time to buy that, and it's right now in the last 2 years. It's actually a really good time to buy early photography. I've seen dealers lower their prices for early photography in the last couple of years, which is amazing.
Well, I really meant more trends by contemporary.
And prints by contemporary photographers. We are definitely thinking about trends. We're thinking about what's important, what the current conversations, visual conversations that are going on. And you'll hear more about that from Kristen in a couple weeks. I'm sure she'll be talking about what are some of the hot themes of the moment in our field. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you everybody for coming today and your wonderful questions.
Thank you.